My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and 3 weeks after my father died. Our family gathered in a lawyer's office to hear his will. The moment my sister stood up and confidently announced the house already belonged to her, I realized she had absolutely no idea what Dad had done 6 months before he died. Not that she was lying, but that she believed it so completely. She had no idea what our father had actually done 6 months before he died. The lawyer hadn't even finished opening the folder yet. We were sitting inside a quiet office that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The rain outside tapped softly against the windows, and the entire room felt heavy with that uncomfortable silence families carry when they're waiting to hear how someone's life gets divided after they're gone. My Aunt Linda sat beside me, twisting a tissue in her hands. My cousin Mark stared down at the carpet. Across the table, my older sister Rachel leaned back in her chair with the kind of confidence that didn't match the mood in the room at all. Rachel had always been like that. Certain, sure of how things would turn out. Sure the world owed her something. The lawyer, Mr. Bennett, adjusted his glasses and began speaking in a calm, professional tone. Thank you all for coming today. As you know, we are here to review the last will and testament of Mr. Thomas Carter. Hearing our father's name spoken like that, past tense, legal, final, made something tighten quietly in my chest. Dad had passed away 3 weeks earlier. Lung complications after a long year of health problems. The kind of slow illness that gives families time to prepare, but never enough time to actually be ready. Mr. Bennett continued, "Your father's will outlines the distribution of his remaining financial accounts, personal belongings, and property." Rachel suddenly lifted a hand. "Actually," she said casually, interrupting him, "we can probably skip the house part." The lawyer blinked, slightly confused. Rachel smiled and crossed her arms. "Dad already promised me the house years ago. Everyone knows that." The room shifted. You could feel it. My Aunt Linda looked at Rachel uncertainly. Mark glanced between us. Rachel kept talking as if she were already giving a tour of the place. I mean, it makes sense, right? I'm the one who stayed close to Dad. I'm the one who helped him the most these past few years. She shrugged like the decision had been obvious all along. Emily moved away, built her own life, so the house was always going to be mine. Her words hung in the air like they had already been stamped into reality. And the strange part? She had been saying this for years. At birthdays, at family dinners, at Christmas. Dad promised the house to me someday. Every time she said it, she sounded more certain. And slowly, the rest of the family had started believing it too. I didn't say anything. I just sat there quietly, my hands folded in my lap. Because while Rachel was speaking with complete confidence, I knew something she didn't. 6 months before Dad died, he had called me late one night. It was almost midnight when my phone rang. His voice sounded tired, older than I had ever heard it. "If Emily," he said, "can you come by this weekend? There's something important I need to talk to you about." I had driven 3 hours the next morning without asking any questions. When I arrived at the house, the same house Rachel was currently claiming as hers, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured. He looked thinner, but his eyes were sharp, serious. The way they got when he had made up his mind about something, that conversation changed everything. But Rachel never knew about it. Not then. Not during the months that followed. And definitely not now. Back in the lawyer's office, Rachel was still talking. "I've already been thinking about renovating the place," she said casually. "The kitchen definitely needs updating. And the back porch." Mr. Bennett gently cleared his throat. Rachel paused. The lawyer slowly opened the folder in front of him. "I understand," he said calmly, "that there may have been conversations about the house in the past." Rachel nodded confidently. "Exactly." Mr. Bennett looked down at the documents for a moment. Then he said something that made the entire room go very still. "Well, the house actually isn't part of the estate anymore." Rachel frowned. "What?" The lawyer folded his hands together. "The property was legally transferred 6 months before your father's passing." Rachel laughed lightly, shaking her head. Okay, transferred to who? Mr. Bennett reached into the folder and pulled out a document. Then he slowly slid it across the table, right toward her. Rachel grabbed the paper, still smiling. But the moment her eyes reached the name written on the deed, the smile disappeared. Her face went completely pale, and for the first time since she walked into that room, she turned and looked directly at me. Because printed clearly on the document, as the legal owner of our father's house, was my name, Emily Carter. When Rachel looked up from the document and stared at me like she had just seen a ghost, I knew what everyone else in the room was thinking. How? How did the house end up in my name? To them, it probably looked impossible, because for most of our lives, Rachel had been the one everyone assumed would eventually get it. She was the older sister, 3 years older than me, louder, more confident, and always very good at convincing people she deserved things. And for a long time, she had our father completely convinced too. Growing up, our lives revolved around that house. A small 2-story place at the edge of town with a big maple tree in the front yard. Dad bought it when I was 5 years old. Back then it felt enormous to me. The creaky wooden stairs, the kitchen that always smelled like coffee in the mornings, the backyard where Dad spent entire weekends fixing things that didn't really need fixing. After our mother died when I was 14, that house became the only thing that still felt stable. Dad tried his best to keep everything together, but grief changes families in quiet ways. Rachel handled it by staying close to him, sometimes too close. At first it seemed harmless. She started helping Dad with errands. She stayed home instead of moving away after high school. She told everyone she wanted to be there for him, and Dad appreciated it. Of course he did. He was lonely, and Rachel was the daughter who stayed. Meanwhile, I left for college 2 years later, not because I didn't love Dad, but because I knew if I stayed, I would never leave. I worked 2 part-time jobs and lived in a tiny apartment near campus. Scholarships covered most of my tuition. The rest I paid slowly, semester by semester. Rachel, on the other hand, stayed in the house with Dad well into her 20s. And that was when things started changing. At first it was small things. She would borrow money, just until my next paycheck. Then it became bigger things. A car she couldn't afford, credit cards she couldn't pay off. Every few months there was a new financial emergency. Dad helped her every time. I didn't know the full extent of it back then, but I could see the pattern. Whenever I visited, Rachel was always talking about money, complaining about bills, talking about how unfair life was. And somewhere in the middle of all that, she started saying the same sentence over and over again. At family dinners, during holidays, even in casual conversations. Dad says the house will be mine someday. The first time she said it, I didn't think much about it. Parents say things like that sometimes. But Rachel didn't say it like a casual comment. She said it like a contract had already been signed. Obviously, the house will go to me, she told our aunt once during Thanksgiving dinner. I'm the one who stayed and helped Dad all these years. Everyone around the table nodded politely. No one questioned it. And Dad never corrected her. That was the part that bothered me. Not because I cared about the house. At that point in my life, I was focused on building my own future. I had started working at a small accounting firm. I was finally financially stable. But every time Rachel repeated that sentence, I noticed something strange about Dad. He would go quiet, not angry, not proud, just quiet, like he was letting something happen that he wasn't completely comfortable with. Over the years, Rachel's confidence about the house only grew stronger. By the time she was 34, she talked about it as if it already belonged to her. She even started making plans. I'll probably remodel the kitchen first, she once told me over the phone. Dad's cabinets are ancient. I remember laughing a little. Rachel, I said, it's still Dad's house. She sounded almost offended. Well, yeah, but he already told me it's mine eventually. Eventually, that word did a lot of work in Rachel's mind. Eventually meant she didn't need to worry about stability. Eventually meant everything would fall into place. Eventually meant the house would solve all her problems. But what Rachel didn't know was that over the last few years, Dad had started noticing things. Little things at first. Bills arriving that didn't make sense. Phone calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Letters from banks addressed to Rachel, but connected to his address. And the more he looked into it, the more worried he became. Because Rachel wasn't just struggling with money, she was sinking into debt. The kind of debt that doesn't disappear quietly, the kind that follows you, and eventually, the kind that can take everything you own, which is exactly why, 6 months before he died, Dad called me late one night and said something that completely changed what was going to happen to that house. "Emily," he told me quietly over the phone, "I think your sister is about to lose everything." And then he said the sentence that started the chain of events Rachel was now discovering for the first time in that lawyer's office. "I need your help protecting the house." When my father called me that night, his voice sounded different from the way it usually did. Not weak, not sick, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from realizing something too late. "Emily," he said quietly over the phone, "can you come by this weekend? There's something important I need to talk to you about." It was almost midnight when he called. I didn't ask many questions. When your parent is sick, you learn not to delay visits. So the next morning, I got in my car and drove the 3 hours back to the house where we grew up. The same house Rachel was now claiming as hers. When I arrived, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee were already waiting. That alone told me the conversation had been planned. The house felt quieter than I remembered. Rachel's car wasn't in the driveway. "Where's Rachel?" I asked. Dad sighed. "She's staying with a friend for a few days." That answer sounded rehearsed. I sat down across from him. For a moment, he just looked at me, the way parents sometimes do when they're deciding how much truth to tell. Then he slid a small stack of papers across the table. "Look at these." I picked them up. Bank statements, loan notices, credit card balances. Some of them had Rachel's name on them. Some had Dad's address attached. And the numbers were bad. Really bad. I looked up slowly. "Dad, what is all this?" He rubbed his forehead with one hand. "I didn't realize how bad things had gotten," he said quietly. "Not until a few months ago. Apparently it had started with phone calls. Collectors asking about Rachel. At first Dad assumed it was some kind of mistake. Then more letters started arriving. Banks, credit companies, loan services, and the amounts kept growing. Rachel had opened multiple lines of credit, personal loans, even short-term high-interest loans, all tied to the house address. Some of these lenders think she owns this place already," Dad said. That sentence made something cold settle in my stomach. "Does she?" I asked. Dad shook his head immediately. "No." But then he hesitated. "I may have given her the impression she would someday." That didn't surprise me. Rachel had been repeating that story for years. But Dad looked deeply troubled now. "The problem isn't just the debt," he continued. "The problem is how desperate she's getting." He pointed to one of the letters. Rachel had taken out a loan so large that if she ever defaulted on it while owning property, that property could be seized, which meant the house, our house, the one place that had survived every hard moment in our family. I leaned back in the chair, trying to process everything. "Does Rachel know you've seen all this?" Dad shook his head slowly. "She thinks I still believe she's just going through a temporary rough patch." I stared at the stack of papers again. "Dad, this is serious." "I know." For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the quiet ticking of the wall clock. Then Dad said something that made me realize he had already made a decision before I even arrived. "I went to speak with a lawyer last week." I looked up. "What about?" He held my eyes. "The house?" My chest tightened slightly. "Dad, you don't have to worry about me. I'm not expecting— This isn't about inheritance." He interrupted gently. "It's about protection." He leaned forward in his chair. Emily, if Rachel ever legally owns this house in her current situation," he didn't finish the sentence. "He didn't have to— We both understood. The house could disappear. Sold. Seized. Gone. And Rachel wouldn't even mean for it to happen. She would just keep borrowing and hoping the future solved everything." Dad took a deep breath. "The lawyer suggested something I hadn't considered before." "What?" "A property transfer." The word sat between us. "You mean—" I said slowly. He nodded. Transferring the deed now, while I'm still alive. I felt a strange mix of emotions immediately. Confusion, responsibility, and something heavier. Transferred to who? Dad looked directly at me. To you. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out right away. Because suddenly I understood why Rachel was so confident sitting in that lawyer's office now. She had spent years believing the house would eventually be hers. But 6 months before Dad died, he had already decided that eventually was never going to happen. And the next thing he said would change the entire future of our family. Emily, he said quietly, I need you to protect this house, even if it means protecting it from your sister. For a few seconds after Dad said those words, the kitchen felt strangely quiet. I stared at him across the table, trying to process what he was asking. Dad? I finally said slowly, Are you sure about this? Because transferring a house wasn't a small decision. This wasn't like leaving something in a will. This was permanent, immediate. Once the deed changed hands, it couldn't simply be undone by family arguments later. Dad nodded, but the look on his face wasn't relief. It was worry. I've thought about it for weeks, he said. I didn't want to believe Rachel's situation was this serious. He tapped the stack of papers again. But these loans, these interest rates. Emily, this is the kind of debt that keeps growing. And if she ever owned this house while dealing with it, he didn't finish the sentence, but I knew exactly what he meant. The house could end up in the hands of strangers, sold off by a bank, erased from our family completely. Rachel doesn't mean to destroy things. Dad continued quietly. But she keeps believing the next month will fix everything. That sounded painfully accurate. Rachel had always lived like the future would solve her problems. Another job, another loan, another chance. But real life didn't work that way forever. Why me? I asked. Dad looked surprised by the question. Because you're careful, he said simply. You think before you sign things? He gave a small, tired smile. And because you're the only person I trust not to lose this house. His words carried a kind of weight I hadn't expected. Growing up, Rachel had always been the confident one. The bold one. The one who talked about big plans. I was the quieter sister. The one who kept spreadsheets and saved money. Apparently that difference mattered more to Dad than I had realized. But another problem still hung in the air. Rachel is going to be furious if she finds out, I said. Dad sighed. I know. He leaned back in his chair, staring briefly toward the living room window. That's why she doesn't need to know right now. That answer made my stomach tighten. You want to keep it secret? For now, he said. Legally transferring the house protects it immediately, but telling Rachel today would only start a fight we don't need. He paused. I'm tired, Emily. The honesty in that sentence hit me harder than anything else he had said. Dad had spent the last year dealing with doctor visits, medications, and endless fatigue. The idea of a massive family conflict on top of that clearly exhausted him. I don't want my last month spent arguing about property, he continued quietly. So we handle the paperwork now. Quietly. Then he looked at me again. But there are conditions. I nodded slowly. What kind of conditions? His voice became firmer. First, Rachel can continue living in the house for now if she needs to. I'm not trying to make her homeless. That was a relief. Despite everything, Rachel was still my sister. I wouldn't kick her out, I said. Dad nodded. I know you wouldn't. Then he added the second condition. But under no circumstances can the house be used to pay her debts. That part made perfect sense. If Rachel ever convinced someone to take a loan against the property, everything Dad was trying to prevent would happen anyway. And the third condition? I asked. Dad held my gaze. No matter what Rachel says in the future, you cannot transfer ownership to her if her financial situation stays like this. The seriousness in his voice left no room for misunderstanding. He wasn't just worried about Rachel being angry. He was worried about Rachel destroying something permanent. I looked down at the coffee cup in front of me, thinking, this decision would change how my sister saw me forever. If Rachel ever discovered the truth, she would almost certainly believe I had manipulated Dad, or pressured him, or stolen something that belonged to her. Family stories had a way of rewriting themselves like that. But Dad was right about one thing. If the house stayed unprotected, it might disappear entirely. Finally, I looked back up. Okay, I said quietly. Dad exhaled slowly, like he had been holding his breath. 2 days later, we drove together to the lawyer's office. The same office where Rachel was now sitting 6 months later, convinced the house belonged to her. Mr. Bennett had explained everything carefully that day. The property transfer was legal, permanent, witnessed, notarized. When the paperwork was finished, Dad handed me a copy of the new deed. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. I remember asking him one last question before we left. "What if Rachel never understands why you did this?" Dad stood silently for a moment before answering. Then he said something I would never forget. "Sometimes protecting someone means not giving them what they want." 6 months later, sitting in that lawyer's office while Rachel stared at the document with my name on it, I realized she was about to learn exactly what he meant, and the explosion that followed was even worse than I expected. For several seconds after Rachel read the name on the document, the room went completely silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself has stopped moving. Rachel's eyes stayed locked on the paper in her hands. Then slowly, very slowly, she looked up at me. The confusion on her face quickly turned into something else, something sharper. "What is this?" she said. Her voice was tight, almost shaky. Mr. Bennett remained calm behind his desk. "That," he said evenly, "is the official deed transfer for the property at 214 Maple Street." Rachel's eyes moved back down to the document, then up again. "This has to be wrong." "No," the lawyer replied gently. "It's quite correct." She laughed suddenly, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind people make when they're trying to convince themselves something ridiculous is happening. "This makes no sense," she said. "Dad promised that house to me." No one in the room responded. Rachel looked around the table as if expecting someone to support her. "Aunt Linda, you heard him say it before, right?" My aunt shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Well, Rachel, he may have said something like that years ago." Rachel turned back toward the lawyer. "So fix it," she said sharply. "This must be some paperwork mistake." Mr. Bennett folded his hands together on the desk. "There is no mistake." He opened the folder again and pulled out several additional documents. The property was transferred 6 months prior to Mr. Carter's passing. It was signed in person, witnessed, and notarized. Rachel's expression changed again. This time, the anger came out clearly. She slammed the paper down onto the table. "So what? Emily tricked him into signing something?" All eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of the room pressing in, but I kept my voice calm. "I didn't trick Dad into anything." Rachel leaned forward, her face flushed. "Oh, really? Because somehow the house he promised me my entire life magically ended up in your name." The word magically dripped with sarcasm. "Rachel," I said quietly, "Dad made his own decision." "That's not true," she snapped. "You must have pressured him when he was sick." The accusation hung in the air. I could see the uncertainty on some of our relatives' faces, because when families argue about inheritance, people always wonder who influenced who. Mr. Bennett cleared his throat again. "I can assure you that Mr. Carter was fully competent when the transfer was completed." Rachel didn't even look at him. She was still staring at me. "You stole it." The words were quiet this time, but they carried more anger than when she had shouted. Before I could respond, the lawyer spoke again. "There is another document your father asked me to present today." Rachel crossed her arms. "What document?" "A letter." That caught everyone's attention. Rachel frowned. "A letter about what?" Mr. Bennett picked up a sealed envelope from the folder. "Your father left a written explanation regarding the property transfer." Rachel's confidence flickered for the first time. "Why would he need to explain it?" The lawyer looked at her carefully before answering. "I believe he expected today's reaction might happen." That sentence seemed to hit Rachel harder than anything else so far. For the first time since she had entered the room, she looked uncertain. "What does it say?" she demanded. Mr. Bennett glanced toward me briefly. Dad had warned me this moment might come. I nodded. "Go ahead." The lawyer carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it slowly. Everyone in the room leaned forward slightly. Rachel's jaw tightened as she watched him prepare to read. And in that moment, I realized something. Rachel had spent years believing the house was already hers. But the truth she was about to hear was going to destroy that belief completely. Mr. Bennet adjusted his glasses and began reading the letter aloud. My daughters, if you are hearing this letter, it means the house situation has already caused tension between you. Rachel's face went rigid, and before the lawyer even finished the first paragraph, I knew exactly what was coming next. Because my father had written the one thing Rachel never expected to hear from him. The truth about why he had trusted me with the house, instead of her. Mr. Bennet adjusted the paper in his hands and began reading. My daughters, if you are hearing this letter, it means the house situation has already caused tension between you. I hoped it wouldn't happen, but I know both of you well enough to understand that it probably would. Rachel shifted in her chair, her arms still crossed tightly. I could already see the anger building behind her eyes. The lawyer continued, I want both of you to understand something clearly. This decision was not made out of favoritism, and it was not made in secret to punish anyone. Rachel let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Oh, really? She muttered under her breath. Mr. Bennet ignored the interruption and kept reading. The house on Maple Street has been the center of our family for most of our lives. After your mother passed away, it became the one place that kept us grounded. Hearing Dad's words spoken out loud felt strange. It was like hearing his voice echo through someone else. That house is more than a property. The letter continued. It represents stability, and for the last few years, I became increasingly worried that stability was at risk. Rachel's jaw tightened. Her fingers tapped impatiently against the table. Mr. Bennet turned the page slightly and continued. Rachel, I know you believe I promised the house to you someday. I may have said things over the years that gave you that impression. For that, I take responsibility. Rachel looked up quickly. For a brief moment, it seemed like she thought the letter might suddenly swing in her favor, but the next line erased that hope immediately. However, over the past 2 years, I learned things that made me realize giving you ownership of the house right now would not protect you or the property. Rachel's eyes narrowed. What things? She snapped. The lawyer calmly kept reading. I discovered the loans connected to the house address, the credit accounts, the letters from lenders, and the calls that began arriving late in the evening. The room grew still again. Rachel's face slowly began to turn pale. Mr. Bennet continued in the same steady tone. Debt itself is not something to be ashamed of. Many people struggle with it at some point in their lives. But the size and structure of the debt concerned me deeply. My Aunt Linda glanced toward Rachel with quiet concern. Rachel didn't look at anyone. Her eyes were fixed on the table now. If the house had ever legally belonged to Rachel in her current financial situation, the lawyer read, there was a very real possibility it could be taken by creditors. Rachel suddenly slammed her hand on the table. That's not true! But her voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. Mr. Bennet paused only briefly before continuing. My goal was never to punish Rachel or embarrass her. My goal was to protect something that cannot easily be replaced. The lawyer looked down at the final paragraph. That is why I transferred ownership of the house to Emily while I was still alive. Rachel's breathing had become noticeably heavier. She has always been careful with money. She plans for the future. I trust her judgment. Rachel finally looked up again. But this time, the anger in her eyes had changed into something more complicated, something closer to hurt. I did not make this decision because Emily deserved the house more. The letter continued. I made it because I believe she will protect it, even when it becomes difficult. Mr. Bennet lowered the page slightly. There is one final request I asked Emily to honor. Everyone leaned forward again. Rachel stared at the lawyer as if she was bracing herself for another blow. If Rachel needs a place to stay in the future, I hope Emily will allow her to remain in the house temporarily. Rachel blinked. That clearly wasn't what she expected to hear. But the house must never be used as security for loans or debt. The lawyer finished reading. It must remain a home, not a financial escape. The room fell quiet again. Mr. Bennet folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. For a long moment, no one spoke. Rachel sat completely still. Then slowly she looked up at me. "You knew," she said. "It wasn't a question. You knew this whole time." I nodded gently. "Yes." Her eyes searched my face like she was trying to find anger or guilt. But there wasn't any, only exhaustion. Rachel leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. For the first time since the meeting started. She didn't look furious. She looked defeated. But the final moment of this story was still waiting. Because what happened next would decide whether our family completely shattered or somehow survived what Dad had done. For a long time after the lawyer finished reading Dad's letter, no one in the room spoke. Rachel sat back in her chair, staring at the table as if the wood grain might somehow rearrange itself into a different reality. A few minutes earlier, she had walked into that office completely certain of something. Certain the house was hers. Certain the future had already been decided. Now that certainty was gone, and what remained looked a lot like quiet shock. "You knew," she said again, her voice lower this time. I nodded. Yes. The truth felt strangely simple now that everything had been said out loud. Rachel rubbed her hands over her face. "When?" she asked. 6 months ago." Her head lifted quickly. 6 months? She repeated. "That's when Dad transferred the deed." The room remained silent around us. Even our relatives seemed unsure whether they should stay or quietly excuse themselves. Rachel shook her head slowly. "So all this time, every time I talked about the house," her voice faded. I knew what she meant. Family dinners, holiday conversations, the casual way she had described renovation plans like they were already guaranteed. "Yes," I said softly. "I knew." Rachel let out a humorless laugh. "Wow." She leaned back again and stared at the ceiling for a moment. "I guess Dad really thought I'd destroy the place." "No," I said. Rachel looked at me sharply. "That's not what he thought." "Then what?" "He thought you might lose it." Those words landed differently. Not like an accusation. More like a quiet truth neither of us could pretend away anymore. Rachel didn't respond immediately. She just looked down at the table again. "I didn't realize he knew about the loans," she said eventually. "I think he noticed earlier than you thought," I replied. She nodded slowly. Yeah, the anger that had filled the room earlier seemed to have burned itself out. What remained now was something heavier. Reality. After a few more seconds, Rachel asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "So what happens now?" It was a fair question. Legally, the answer was already clear. The house belonged to me. But families are rarely that simple. I looked at Rachel for a moment before speaking. "You can stay in the house." Her head lifted slightly. "But only if a few things change." She watched me carefully. "No more loans tied to the address," I said. "No using the property for credit or collateral." Rachel nodded slowly. "And the bills?" she asked. "You cover the utilities and your own expenses," I said. "I'll handle the property taxes and maintenance." She studied my face for a moment. "You're serious?" "Yes." Rachel leaned back again, absorbing that. For a long time she didn't speak. Then finally she said something that surprised me. "I really thought Dad trusted me with it." I thought about that for a moment. "He did trust you?" I said. "Just not with that." Rachel gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah." The lawyer began quietly organizing the papers on his desk, clearly sensing the meeting was reaching its end. As we stood to leave, Rachel paused near the door. She turned back toward me. "Emily?" "Yeah?" She hesitated. Then she said the one thing I never expected to hear from her. "Don't sell it." I shook my head. "I won't." Rachel nodded once. Because deep down, she understood something now that she hadn't understood before. Dad hadn't given me the house because I deserved it more. He gave it to me because he believed I would protect it, even if that meant protecting it from my own sister. And as we walked out of the lawyer's office together, I realized something my father had understood long before either of us did. A house isn't just something you inherit. Sometimes, it's something you're trusted to save.